Canadian Pacific's Laggan Sub is one of North America's most picturesque main lines. It runs for 136 miles between Calgary, Alberta and Field, British Columbia. Passing through Banff, Lake Louise, and the famous spiral tunnels, this line and area are known throughout the world. As these views give a glimpse of the line ahead, a brief rundown of our trip west is in order. We'll ride the head end of Via Train Number 1, the famous Canadian, aboard Via Unit 6311, a newly rebuilt FP9, which was originally CN 6529. As the miles are covered, glimpses of the same location in the 30s or early 40s will be seen, as will on-the-ground coverage of today's operations. Floyd Yates, a retired CP locomotive engineer, will provide us with a unique insight into the Laggan Sub. Born in Field, BC, the son of a CP engineman, Floyd worked the Laggan Sub for most of his 41 years with CP and retired off the Canadian in 1979. His knowledge of the line is unsurpassed, and in 1985 he wrote a book entitled Canadian Pacific's Big Hill. Be prepared during our passage through the lower spiral tunnel, as Floyd gives us a very special look at railroading on the Laggan Sub over 40 years ago. Well, the conductor has given us the highball, the dispatcher has us lined. Let's head west. She's all yours, Floyd.
Thanks, Steve, for your introduction. We release the automatic brake and the independent brake and proceed to relieve Calgary Station for the trip to Field. Quarter mile up the track, we will enter the wash rack, where the train will be washed. This is a picture years ago of a steam engine leaving the same station. Palliser Hotel, the CBR's famous hotel in Calgary, in the background. This wash rack is not popular with the train and engine crews, as we're paid by the mile, not by the hour. And the 20 minutes or so taken to wash an 18 or 20 car train, you do this for free. But it's part of the CPR's policy of having clean trains so that people can take pictures through this scenic territory. We are now entering the gap west of Exshaw, which is the entrance to the Rocky Mountains. This is taken from the cab of the unit. This is approaching Banff with Tunnel Mountain on the left. This Tunnel Mountain was called Tunnel because when they first built the railroad, they thought they'd have to tunnel through this mountain. But eventually they found a way around the side of it. A westbound freight train leaves Banff ahead of the Canadian, number 1, and number 1 will be arriving right behind them. We'll see an early shot of a steam engine, by the looks of it number 3, sitting at Banff Station, ready to take water. The Canadian arrives at Banff. Notice the people on the station platform. This is a very busy place for departures and arrivals, as it's a great tourist place staying at the Banff Springs Hotel. Sometimes the train is completely emptied at Banff and refilled up with new people. Banff is a 10-minute stop for the Canadian. Passengers love this, a chance to get out and stretch their legs and also to take pictures of some of them their first view of the Rockies. The engine crews like this because they can go back and get a cup of coffee. Looks like they've had their cup of coffee and about ready to leave as soon as the baggage is loaded or unloaded. We are now leaving the west switch at Mast 3. This is a beautiful corner for taking pictures on, and the passengers can look back and see the whole train behind them. As we swing around the next corner to the right after this corner, you will see an osprey nest on the right-hand side. The ospreys sit on this nest, and as the train comes by, they lift off the nest, make a complete circle, and land back on the nest. But some days when the train is 4 or 5 cars longer than usual, they get fooled and they get back to the nest too soon. Castle Mountain is in the foreground as we proceed west up the Bow Valley. Here's an eastbound passenger train with Castle Mountain in the background in the steam days. We are now at mileage 113. Up on the road to the right is where Nick Morant, the famous CPR photographer, took an awful lot of his prized pictures. This is 3 miles east of Lake Louise, and it's a beautiful spot for taking pictures because it has a reverse curve. One is to the left and one is to the right. The Chateau Lake Louise and Lake Louise is up in the valley to the ahead. Here's an eastbound in the same spot, Nick Morant's Corner. This is a beautiful place for taking pictures. Valley is on the right. We are now at Lake Louise. A westbound freight train hurries ahead of the Canadian up the new line built from Lake Louise to Stevens, which cut the grade down to 1%. On the line in the lower where the people are is the one the passenger trains use. It is 1 3/4%, and the Canadian is expected any moment. Here is the Canadian arriving at Lake Louise with the new line to the right. Lake Louise Station is a beautiful station built of logs years ago, and still one of the most picturesque stations on the CPR. Again, notice all the passengers on the platform. This again is a busy place for passengers getting on and off. On the left, the bare spot there is what they used to call the garden tracks. Trains were stored in there, and the people slept in them and ate up at the Chateau Lake Louise. And the trains came Tuesday and Thursday and ran from Chicago to Los Angeles by way of the Canadian Rockies. We are now at the top of the hill from Lake Louise to Stephen and are prepared to start down the field. This is the Alberta CPC board. A westbound freight train arrives at Stephen on the new track, and here he will let the Canadian go by as he has to stop and make a full brake test before proceeding down the 2.2% grade field. This point was called Resurrection Point because the fireman could get back a little steam while he stopped at Stephen making a brake test. Notice the slave units in the robot car in the middle of the train. This is on all drags westbound to Calgary. The westbound Canadian will arrive on the old line to the right. As he passes the freight train, the Canadian will not stop at Stephen, but he will make a running brake test. That is, he will apply the brakes till the engineer feels the train slow down and then release them and proceed on down the hill. flat spot on the hill between Stephen and Field. Wapta Lake is on the right. This lake is over 650 foot deep. A steam shot taken in the same place 40 years ago. We are now arriving at Partridge. This sighting was called after an engineer. He was a fireman at the time by the name of Seth Partridge. He, in the early 20s, was firing on a pusher engine, and in the middle of the night he heard a rock slide coming down off Mount Cathedral to the left. And knowing there was sectionmen and operators living down in Yoho and Cathedral down below, he got off the engine, ran down through the trees with these 10, 20-ton rocks rolling down behind him, and alerted the crews at Yoho and Cathedral, thus saving many lives. On consequence, the CPR named this siding Partridge after him. This siding was out of service for years when the trains got longer, but as centralized traffic control came in, they had to restore it again. We are entering the top of the top tunnel here on the first of the famous spiral tunnels. These tunnels have water problems in the summer, which isn't bad, but in the wintertime this water turns to ice and necessitates a crew being in the tunnels all the time, chipping ice all winter. These crews stay at Yoho. They abandon the side of the part of the Cathedral. Notice how tight the curves are on the tunnel and the guardrails to keep the train if it derails from hitting the walls. We are now approaching Yoho, which used to be a siding on the hill, but there wasn't room between it and Cathedral for an intermediate board, so they had to abandon it and restore Partridge above, which is on the right up the hill 200 or 300 feet. Yoho now is used just for storing cars or work crews. You will notice the work cars in the siding and backtrack at Yoho. This is Yoho siding on the right. We're now going under the first of two underpasses on the Trans-Canada Highway. The old siding at Yoho is to the left. This is the east mile board at Cathedral, and we're going to enter the top of the lower spiral tunnel. It's not uncommon to see mountain sheep run out of this tunnel who have been in there licking ice off the tracks. Now we revert back to the late 30s and early 40s. I took these pictures with a Bell and Howell camera, and it shows Field Hill as it was in the old days. Most of these engines were 210-2s, 210-4s, 482s, and 282s. They're shown in various stages on Field Hill, on passenger trains, and on freight trains. Here is a 5800, a 210-2, and a 5900, a 210-4 on a section of passenger train. The position to be on these trains was on the first engine if you could, because there was less smoke there and less fumes than on the second or third. The third engine was not a desired position, and I have seen engineers on passenger who found there was coal burners on the engines up ahead. They wanted to be cut in on the head end, not next to the train. Notice on some of the tenders as they go by, you will see a very black mark. This is the sweat line. As the engines went into the tunnels with the cold water in their tenders, there's the sweat line on that train. You could see how much water was in the tender by just looking out the window and back and see the sweat line. The smoke for these crews was very bad on Field Hill. Sometimes they used 4-engine pushers, but this was abandoned because 2 or 3 crews on the final engine on the hill they found passed out after they come through the tunnel, so this was cut out. Here is a freight train coming up the hill with an engine cut in the middle of the train. Here is another freight train coming around the edge of Lake Wapta. This train will have a pusher on the tail end. Passenger trains were never pushed from the tail end due to the danger of shoving in a car. You will notice the tail end pusher on this train. Some of the trains you'll see on passenger were very short, These are sections of regular passenger trains. If a passenger train was more than 18 cars, it was usually split at Revelstoke into sections and run from Revelstoke to Calgary in sections and then put back together again at Calgary. This next picture gives a good example of that. Here comes a section. To see a train with only one engine on passenger, you knew pretty well it was a section. I think this one has 4 cars. This will all be put back together again at Calgary in a single train. Notice the old buses at Banff Station meeting the trains in the middle 40s. This is a section of passenger with a 5400 ready to leave Banff. Notice this third engine, how bad it's smoking. This means the fireman is crowding it because he's short of steam, and so you force as much coal or as much oil, depending on what type of engine it is, to try and gain back your steam. So when you look back and saw the engine behind you crowding, you knew he was having trouble for steam. Here's a westbound train with a 5900 on emerging from the bottom of the lower spiral tunnel. Here's a freight train going up the hill in the same position, just leaving Cathedral, or the east switch of Cathedral, preparing to enter the bottom of the lower spiral tunnel. This 2 5800s and 1 5900, as you'll see in this picture, it was the usual arrangement in the summer. There was as high as 10 passenger trains went up and down Field Hill in less than 4 hours in the summer. And needless to say, by late in the afternoon, the smoke in them tunnels got pretty thick. And a lot of these pusher engines had to get back down the hill from Stephen to Field to bring up another train later on in the day. Here's an eastbound passenger train arriving Banff Station. The same train with the caboose, or as we call it, hay rack, observation car on the tail end. Back on the hill with more passenger and freight trains up the hill. A westbound freight train leaving Cathedral. You will see in the next scene a passenger train coming up the hill with only one 5900 on. This is probably number 2. Number 2, if you had more than 9 cars, you needed a pusher. 9 cars and less, a 5900 could handle it up the hill. Both these engines look like they're having trouble for steam. They're crowding it pretty heavy. It wasn't unusual for trains to stall on the hill because one of the pusher engines didn't have enough steam, and they stopped, blew it up, and got her back to 285 again, and away they went. This happened quite regular, especially later in the day as the air in the tunnels got pretty thick and the engines couldn't breathe. Here's a passenger train with one engine coming up the hill. He must have 9 cars or less. A westbound passenger train passing Castle Mountain. Now here as we come out of this tunnel, we'll revert back to a freight train going up the hill from the present day. Mount Stephen in the background. This is a freight train coming up the hill. Now if this train has 100 or more cars, usually the engines are out of the tunnel and above the caboose before the caboose is gone in the tunnel. When you were coming down the hill in the same situation, you didn't leave your cab windows open because usually the train crews gathered some snow off the roof of the caboose, and if you had your cab windows open, there was no trouble throwing a snowball 75 feet down, hitting you in the head. So made a point of keeping your windows shut. You'll see the engine, as the caboose goes in the tunnel, you'll see the engine appear above it. Trains going up the hill in steam days, the brakemen used to jump off here, walk up that short path by the silver box there, and get on the engine as the engine came out of the tunnel. That way they got away from all the smoke and dirt in the tunnels and had to laugh on the fireman and engineer. Here's the engine just passing over the entrance of the tunnel. These spiral tunnels are very famous, and photographers come from all over the world to take this shot here, and they just love it when they can get a train that's long enough that the caboose hasn't gone in and the engine's out. This happened in steam days, but was very rare because, as I say, it took a 100-car train and could usually only be a train of empties that was that long in steam days. There's a westbound train arriving at Field. This is the second underpass under the Trans-Canada Highway at the west switch at Cathedral. After we leave here, we'll go through a short tunnel. This tunnel was quite a problem when they built the Trans-Canada Highway in 1956. The contractor, Manic Construction, wanted to blow the whole face of the hill off there on the rail and on the highway below, so they wouldn't have to take it off in bits and pieces. But the CPR declined, and so the highway was built around the edge of the face of the rock. Perhaps when the CPR had to double track this hill in years to come, they'll wish they had taken the opportunity to daylight the tunnel. It's just a short tunnel, and Manic said that they wouldn't have held up the trains more than 8 hours from the time the last train went through to the next one. They would have the track back in service in 8 hours.
Yeah, I may need a fuse for the air conditioning, Cut.
As we come out of this tunnel up to the left, you'll see where the big slide was, the one that caused most of the trouble, and there's always slides across the track, rot slides, snow slides, etc. There used to be a snow shed here, but it was taken out less than 4 or 5 years ago, and an electric fence was put into its place. This fence, if it's breached by a rock rolling down the mountain, rings a bell to the field and in the dispatcher's office in Calgary, and also puts the signal that stops for any trains going up or down the hill. Here's a typical CPR snow shed as used in the Kicking Horse and the Rogers Pass. These snow sheds are very strong and carry a tremendous amount of weight on the roof. On your left is another one of these slide fences. They're not meant to stop rocks, they're just meant to record rocks going through so that you can put the signals that stop. Another snow shed. To your right is the Kicking Horse River, and the Trans-Canada Highway by now is down in the valley. As we arrive at the east mileboard at Field, you will notice as the trains come into Field, some of the cars are smoking quite heavy. This didn't happen while CP was running, but as VIA took over, they started using some of the CN units, which had no dynamic brake. Is the house where I was born in Field. And the railway crossing in Field here is sometimes blocked by 30 minutes by freight trains making brake tests as they go eastbound and westbound. But the people in Field mostly working for CP are happy about it. Notice the smoke coming from underneath the cars now, but it'll only be from old CN cars who have the steel shoes. CP cars have disc brakes. Arriving at Field Station, this is where we'll get off and turn the train over to the Revelstoke crew, who will take it through the mountain subdivision, 125 miles to Revelstoke. We will stay overnight in Field and catch number 2, the eastbound Canadian, in the morning. As we make our final stop at Field, we hope you've enjoyed your trip on the beautiful Laggan Sub from Calgary to Field, and that you yourself will take this trip someday. Here's a westbound passenger train about to leave Field at the old station. As an eastbound freight train tackles the hill, number 1, the Canadian, will leave to continue its journey on to Vancouver.